Welcome to episode 52 of the Eat for Endurance podcast. I am really excited about my guest today, sports scientist Andy Blow. In his younger days, Andy was an elite level triathlete, finishing in the top 10 of Ironman and 70.3 races, as well as winning an Xterra world title. He also previously worked as the team sports scientist for the Benetton and Renault Formula One teams and remains an advisor to the Porsche Human Performance Center at Silverstone, home of the British Grand Prix. Andy's struggles with sports nutrition and his own race experiences ultimately led him to set up his company, Precision Fuel and Hydration, which specializes in helping athletes discover their unique hydration needs and create individualized fueling and hydration strategies for training and competitions. I absolutely loved the discussion that we had today. It's a bit of a long one because I got Andy to indulge my endless curiosity about the world of Formula One. So if you're at all interested in that, you're in for a treat. He also is an expert in hydration, and we really spent a lot of time going into tons of detail on this huge, important topic. We didn't break any new ground here, of course, because, Andy's been on so many other shows going through these concepts in detail, and the site that he, for his company has tons of great blog posts here as well. But hydration is such a key topic that so many athletes find confusing that I thought it would be worth sharing once again on my platform too. In full disclosure, I did receive some free sports nutrition samples from Andy's team in advance of this recording, but I have not received any payment from his company, and I'm not affiliated with Precision Fuel and Hydration. I always like to make that clear whenever I'm doing things with companies. So with that said, get ready to take some notes as this episode is packed full of great information. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation all about Formula One and hydration with Andy Blow. Hey, Andy, welcome to the podcast. How's it going today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Very good. Thanks for the invite to come and chat.
Yeah, for sure. And this is coming at the perfect time because I was just about to do a solo episode covering hydration, and I had just finished binging all 4 seasons of the Formula One show on Netflix. Have you watched that one?
I've seen bits and pieces of it. Yeah, for definite. Yeah. It's done wonders for that sport.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like a soap opera. It's amazing. The drama is just, yeah, it's amazing. But when I read your background, I was like, yeah, we need to get you on the schedule ASAP. So this works out well. Very good timing. I saw that you're in Slovakia right now. Is that right?
Yes.
What are you up to over there?
I'm here for something called the PTO Collins Cup, which is a big triathlon event. PTO is the Professional Triathletes Organization, and it's kind of their championship race. And there's a big age group race here as well. And we're Precision Fuel and Hydration we're the official fuel and hydration partners and providers for the athletes. So we are here, and it is I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit. I'd say it's like today it's like 36 Celsius, so I think that's over 100 Fahrenheit. Yikes. So it's definitely hydration is we're getting a lot of athletes coming up and needing hydration advice and products today.
Yeah. Are you sweat testing them there, or is that something that you're not necessarily like doing like on the ground?
100% we are. Yeah, we've done quite a lot of sweat tests today. Yeah, we've had a lot of people getting curious about that and taking the opportunity while we're here on the ground to do a quick sweat test with us. So yeah, I don't know how many we've done today. I lost count. It's so many.
Awesome. So before we dive into today's topic, I'd love for you just to, explore a little bit your own background as a triathlete and as a sports scientist. And I know you've shared this widely on other podcasts, but some of my listeners who are not familiar with your company, Precision Fuel and Hydration, may not be familiar with you. So why don't you just take us through that?
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, I was always keen on sport as a kid growing up in England. As you probably know, most of us play soccer, and that's what I was big into. When I figured out that I wasn't going to be a professional soccer player, I sort of started doing more endurance events. My dad was quite interested in me doing things like cross country running, and I joined a swim club. And at some point, I got entered into a swim run aquathon race and saw that was when I was sort of a young teenager, and there were a load of adult triathletes there, and I got really into triathlon because I saw all the cool bikes and that kind of thing, and then that set me off on a path to pursue triathlon for quite a long time. And alongside that, I always knew that sport was what I was interested in. So I studied sport and exercise science as a degree course at the University of Bath. And it was kind of those two parallel tracks that eventually led me into what I do now with precision fuel and hydration. But along the way, I've worked in, as you've pointed out, I worked in motorsport with Formula One racing drivers, doing sports science support and training for them, and other forms of motorsport. I had a little coaching business and a sports science lab where I was doing physiology testing for athletes. But it was this kind of hybrid thing of, when I was racing triathlon seriously myself, I would generally compete at a high level and do pretty well in cool or cold conditions, but very often long and hot races would completely fall apart for me. And it was pretty obvious early on that it was some kind of hydration problem that I was having, because I do sweat a lot. Anyone who's trained with me can see that. But it took me a long time to understand electrolyte loss, electrolyte balance, and to learn the fact that I lose absolutely tons of sodium in my sweat, or salt in my sweat. And that was when I had a sweat test in a hospital in the early 2000s. That was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because once I figured out how much electrolyte I needed to replace and how much I was replacing in long and hot races, that was the real catalyst for then taking a sort of a slight pivot and really diving into that area as an area of interest.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And just to clarify, you were having this test in a hospital not because you were sick, but because a doctor friend of yours had brought you in to use this technology that was used, I believe, with cystic fibrosis patients typically, that you then acquired as part of your company. But that's right, correct?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Okay.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I was talking to a friend of mine, Dr. Jutley, who's a heart surgeon, and he'd said to me, I think what you're exhibiting signs of is extreme electrolyte and fluid loss when you're racing. And he said there is this thing called a sweat test. So I did a bit of looking around on the internet, and so did my dad, and we found this kind of sweat testing. Anytime when you search sweat testing, it always came up with things about cystic fibrosis. And for anyone who doesn't understand that, CF is a genetic disease that I think about 7% of the population carry the CF gene, but not everyone who's a carrier exhibits signs of it, or has the full expression of the disorder. And one of the characteristics of CF is that you lose a lot of sodium in your sweat because your sweat glands don't function properly. So I effectively went into hospital to have this CF test kind of through the back door, because it was for an athletic purpose and not for a medical purpose. And Dr. Jutley had said to me, I reckon this is going to show that you're pretty off the charts for a normal person without CF for electrolyte loss. And sure enough, he was absolutely on the money. So I had this sweat test. It showed me that I was losing about 1,800 milligrams of sodium in every liter of my sweat, which is getting on for double what the average person loses, and about 4 or 5 times what some people lose. And that, coupled with a high sweat rate, is what was causing me problems. And yeah, you're exactly right about the technology. Ultimately, what we've done with precision fuel and hydration is utilize some of that, the underlying technology that has been used for years with cystic fibrosis diagnostics, and kind of brought that to the attention of athletes and sports scientists and dietitians and nutritionists around the world.
Awesome. Awesome. And we're going to obviously revisit and really dig into all of that in great detail. But before we do that, I want to kind of circle back to the motorsport stuff, because, I'm really new. I'm really new to the whole world of Formula One and motorsport generally. I never watched races or any of that, but, I really became quite fascinated with everything watching the show, especially from just a nutrition hydration standpoint. But, as I said, one thing that really caught my eye when reading your bio was your time involved with Formula One. So I'm really curious to hear about how you got involved, like how that came about, and, maybe sharing a bit more about like your past and ongoing work with motorsport, because I know you also still work, I believe, with the Porsche Human Performance Centers. So can you share a bit more about that?
Definitely. So is a bit of a strange circumstance that led me to working in Formula One to begin with, because the degree course that I did at the University of Bath was one of the things that attracted me to doing that course, was that you did 2 years at the university, then you went and you had to apply for a work placement in industry to get some experience for a year, and then you would come back to university to finish your degree course for the final year. And I thought that sounded really good because you could have an opportunity to learn practically during the course. And so during the second year of university, like everyone on my course, I applied for a number of work placements, some which was with the Ministry of Defence in the UK, some with some professional sports teams. And I went to a few interviews, and when I look back, I was like young and probably a bit cocky and not very well prepared. And I just didn't get any of the opportunities that I went for. So everybody else pretty much on the course got offered work placements, and I was kind of stuck at the end with no placement to do. And one of the course administrators said, look, we've really got to solve this problem for you, because otherwise you're going to be coming back doing the course on your own next year. And so she and I hit the phones, and one of the places that she called was the Benetton Formula One racing team, because she read in an article that they'd just set up a human performance division. And the guy who was running that, a guy called Bernie Shrewsbury, he was looking for a sports scientist at the time, and basically it was just a coincidental call. And he said, well, let's get this lad in for an interview and see. And so he offered me an interview. Of course, there's no other candidates because this was not advertised. He and I got on really well. He was an ex-professional triathlete, so he loved the fact that I was into triathlon. Probably one of the funnier parts is he asked me straight away, because Formula One is a really big and well followed sport in the UK. He said, are you a Formula One fan? And I said, I've got to be honest, no, I'm not really. I don't watch it that much. I don't know. And he said to me, great, if you'd have told me you're a fan, you wouldn't have got a job. Because he wanted someone who was going to be objective about, working with the drivers and not get too starstruck. So he kind of hired me on the spot, gave me a job for the year. And I got in at a great time in Formula One, because Benetton and Bernie were some of the pioneers of fitness training in motorsport. Up until that point, a lot of the fitness training was definitely left to the drivers themselves. A few teams helped them with having personal trainers or whatever, but largely it was not seen as all that necessary or advantageous to plow resources into human performance type stuff. The car was where all the money went, and the driver's job was to turn up, and drive it as fast as he could. So we were kind of at the cutting edge of that. We were starting to do lab tests to assess fitness levels, putting training programs in place, starting to look at their diet and all that kind of thing. And so I had a fabulous year working with Bernie and a physio called Mike Chapman, we were the human performance team, and we traveled all over the world to all the races to do training camps and looked after the drivers. And then when I went back to university for a year, and towards the end of that year, Bernie phoned me up and said, we'd love to have you back for a job. So I was in, and I spent some happy years working for the team. It was fantastic.
That sounds like such a dream. That sounds amazing.
It was very
I got to travel a bit. But also, by the way, I feel like that is such an amazing setup for university, for college, because rather than just being, head in the books, which is certainly what my experience was, this, as you said, you get to go out and apply the knowledge and just get in there and do it. And you probably learn so much more. And then you come back and solidify that with more learning, whatever. And then you get back out into the real world again. I feel like that prepares you so much better for what you are seeking to do. That's awesome. I love it. Okay, awesome. I'm not letting off the hook yet. I still have more Formula One questions, and then we're gonna dive into hydration. Okay. Yeah. So what are you doing with the Porsche Human Performance Center now? What's your involvement like currently?
So the Porsche Human Performance Center is a kind of, or certainly when we set it up, it was a one-of-a-kind facility. When I stopped working in Formula One, one of the things that I did was started working with Porsche on their with some of their drivers on fitness training and education around human performance. And we used to take this kind of Porsche roving roadshow about human performance on the road around racetracks in the UK and interact with a lot of drivers. And then Porsche built this fantastic facility at Silverstone Racetrack, which is the home of the British Formula One Grand Prix, a permanent base to come and do driving experiences from. And we kind of cooked up between us this idea of a human performance center in there that was modeled on the kind of stuff we used to do at Benetton and Renault, the F1 team, but would be accessible to everyone. Because in motorsport, it's a bit like, I suppose, if you use for baseball as an example, F1 is like the major league stuff, and that's where 95% or 98% of all the resources go. And then below that, there's loads of, like the minor leagues, there's lots of other teams and competitions and levels of racing, but they're not as well resourced, and so they don't have human performance setups and that kind of thing. So we set up this lab where people could just pay to play. They could come along, they could tap into the expertise of myself and some of my colleagues that had worked with me in F1, and we did a lot of training programs for young racing drivers, lots of physiological assessments. We built a heat chamber in there so that we could do heat acclimatization work, because a lot of the time the racing drivers live in Northern Europe and then have to go and race in hot countries with no time for proper acclimatization. So and that place still runs today, and I'm still involved with that business, on a and in fact it's another ex-intern from the University of Bath who followed in my footsteps, who now day-to-day runs that facility.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I watched a video, actually. It was the Precision website has some fantastic, links, blog posts, all the stuff, and I'll link to a bunch of them in the show notes. But I was kind of digging around a bit and looking at stuff, and I saw the whole video of, what it looks like to be in the heat chamber and do the sweat test and everything. It's pretty awesome. Really cool. That's so neat. Have you ever done any driving yourself?
Not really, not a lot. I've been a passenger in some fast cars. I've been lucky enough to get in a world rally car, be driven at terrifyingly fast speed around a forest, and on the back of I've been on the back of a modified motorbike. But my driving skill can be summed up by the fact that I did get the chance to go and have some fun with Porsche once and do an ice driving course in northern Finland, right on the Arctic Circle, where they teach you to drive on snow and ice. And at the end of the week, the instructor, each little group, they give a plastic shovel out to the person they have to dig out the snowbanks most often. And I have a shovel hanging up in my garage at home.
Got it. Awesome. All right. Now I hope at some point I can get a driver on this show, because I think it would be so amazing. But until that happens, you are the closest thing I have. So I would love to have you shed some light on, what these athletes are going through. Because one thing I didn't really fully appreciate and realize, number one is because, again, I never watched motorsport races at all. But Formula One, it really is an endurance sport. And as you said, many of these Grand Prix are taking place in extreme conditions. And I didn't realize how long the races are. It's kind of insane. And they're in these suits, and it's just bonkers when I kind of think about not only the training that goes in, and we see, in the Netflix show, you see their performance coaches with them at all times and stuff. So you get the training out. Like, they show tons of shots of them in the gym. Like, you get the feeling that they are training really hard all the time. And that's something, again, I don't think I fully realized you needed to do as a driver, but you do. But then the nutrition hydration piece, that plays a massive role. And the show obviously didn't really give much insight into that, aside from showing them drink occasionally from those super long straws or eating a fruit plate or whatever else it was, So I'd love to, if you can just kind of paint a picture a bit about, why so much training does go into why drivers have to do the level of training that they do, and the role of fueling and hydration as well, because it's not like a triathlon or a race, running race or whatever, where you can just eat and drink whenever you want. These are very different circumstances. So if you can kind of shed light on that, for as much as, for myself too, because I'm trying to understand the sport, that would be awesome.
Yeah, it's probably the easiest way is to sort of break it down into the different stresses that the drivers are under. And I think the first one is one of the biggest ones that gets talked about a lot, as you mentioned, is heat stress, because these guys have to wear fireproof underclothing and fireproof overalls, which are, even though they're made as lightweight as possible these days, and gloves and boots and a balaclava and a helmet for protection, they're obviously, the thermoregulation is already massively compromised. So even if they sweat, which they do, and they sweat a lot, they can lose, as much, if not more, than some endurance athletes when they're in the car in hot climates through sweating, but it doesn't do a lot to help them cool down because it can't evaporate very well. So it just kind of sits in the suit. So the thermal stress is high, and they have some races in places like Malaysia in particular, where it's probably the same kind of climate you would get in southern Florida in the summer. It's like savagely hot, incredible levels of humidity, and then the heat stress on the drivers from the from the from the solar radiation, if they're out in the sun, from the reflected heat from the track, from the heat that comes out of the car engine, which they're sat very close to, means that the thermal load is really, really high. And one of the principal reasons why drivers need to be so aerobically fit and in shape is that aerobic fitness is a fantastic, it helps you to adapt to the heat. So fitter drivers can tend to maintain a better level of physiological and psychological output right to the end of the race if they're fitter. So you have to be able to sort of maintain that high level of concentration. And I suppose that leads on to the next bit, which is that the whole experience of driving a Grand Prix, even for experienced drivers, is like hugely stressful. There's an insane level of scrutiny on these guys. It is like playing in the Super Bowl every time you go out there. The amount of scrutiny that you're under, the level of competitiveness is obviously insanely high. The margin for error is really tiny, although thankfully there's not many deaths in motorsport now compared to what they used to be because of the safety measures. This is still life and death stuff. Those guys go out there every day, they're driving at 200 plus miles an hour. It's crazy fast, and all of that level, you can imagine what that does sort of kind of hormonally and stress levels wise to the body. We used to put heart rate monitors on the drivers when we could some of the time, and have seen them sitting on the grid with heart rates of well above 150 beats a minute, sat still, which
Wow.
is the same as my heart rate is when I'm running, a half marathon. It's really, really high because of that stress load. And what they have to do is execute a very fine but actually quite challenging motor skill, driving the car under load. They have to execute it perfectly for 190 miles. It's unbelievable the pressure that they're under. And so the fitness aspect, a lot of what we describe the fitness aspect being there to do is to allow them to be relaxed at that level of physical and psychological load so that they can still perform all of their tasks as close to perfection as possible. And obviously experience comes into that, and you see that the more experienced drivers are a lot cooler under pressure and that sort of thing. But a lot of it has also to do with the fact that we've all been there, if you're physically stressed, if the level of an activity that you're doing is putting you under horrible levels of physical duress, you can't focus and concentrate and react really, really well because you're too worried about being uncomfortable and how bad you're feeling. Whereas if you're physically in your comfort zone, it's like if you as a runner, if I ask you to run at 2 minutes a mile slower than your marathon pace, that's easy. There's not a lot of stress going on there. If you run at a minute faster per mile than your marathon pace, all of a sudden the level of focus goes up very high. And so you always want drivers to be like as much within their physical comfort zone when they're driving the car as you can. And
Yeah.
I suppose beyond that, you've got the obvious things like the sweat losses, sometimes the physical load of driving the car. Low speed corners and high speed corners have their challenges. They have to stomp really hard on the brake pedals, so they need to be very, very strong, physically for that. And then the other thing we used to talk to drivers about a lot is what happens if they crash, because crashing is almost an inevitable part of the job at some point. And if you're strong and fit, and so if you have a resilient frame, if you have plenty of strong muscle mass, especially in your core and your neck and shoulders and that kind of thing, if you hit the tire wall at 150 miles an hour, you're far more likely to walk out of that in good shape if you are a strong and robust human than if you're not. And so a lot of the sort of more resistance type training and core training is a big insurance policy for the drivers, so that A, they're less likely to get as badly injured in an incident, but B, if they do get injured, and this often happens, and there's like bed rest and rehab time and stuff, starting from a much higher fitness level, a much stronger physical level, means that you can be back in the car sooner because you won't,
That
you
yeah.
won't degrade as much.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for the explanation. I find it all so incredibly fascinating. Like you don't necessarily think about all of this when you watch these things. I mean, it all makes sense, you know, but just like looking at the car going around, it's easy to kind of not think about everything that goes into it. And I find it all incredibly interesting. So talk me through now just the nutrition piece of it, the fueling, the hydration, and how that works given that I mean these races are hours long and I'm assuming they're not drinking while they're in there, right?
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, actually, they are a little bit. So,
Oh,
so they,
amazing.
so
Okay.
they, if they have something like, depends on the car and the driver and the setup, but they can have like 300 to 600 or 700 milliliters of fluid in the car. Um,
How does that
and
work?
usually they usually use something. Or this is, I mean, I was in Formula One few years ago. So whether this has changed significantly recently, I don't know. But what the engineers used to do is rig up a drink system which had some kind of bladder which the drink would be
Yeah.
held in, and
Yeah.
then they would put a tubing along from that with a pump on it, a bit like the pump that powers your window washers on your car. So when
Mm.
when you pull in and spray, and then that would, because of the G-force, you couldn't suck fluid from a bladder
Ah,
when you're driving.
yeah.
So it kind of went through a little hole in the helmet, pointed at the mouth, and then they press a button on the steering wheel and squirts a bit of. If you're unlucky,
Amazing.
it squirts a bit of Gatorade or something in your eye, but hopefully
Oh
they're in your mouth.
no.
Yeah. Um,
That's not
so
good if you need to
so
make quick decisions and see things.
no, but there was always this, and I think it still exists to a degree. There was always this tension when I was involved in it between the kind of engineers who want to keep the car as light as possible and want to focus on things that they can measure, so they can
Mhm.
measure the effect of tire pressures and wing angles and all this kind of stuff. But they can't really measure the effect of whether if you give a driver a drink or not, other than if the driver complains vigorously. And sometimes the driver just gets told to like toughen up a bit and not worry about it. And so we were definitely on the side of the drivers trying to say, look, if you can't expect a driver to, even if they're not what we would call critically dehydrated, even if they
Mm.
feel thirsty, they've got a dry mouth, and it pulls their concentration away in the final few laps because they're just so thirsty they need a drink. You need to be able to give them the opportunity to do that. And so there was always this kind of like, well, we'll do what we can. So one of the things, was always trying to get drivers in the car well hydrated, before they start, which,
Mm.
erroneously in the old days, be drinking loads of water in the build up. And that's probably something we should talk about for athletes in
Oh, we will.
general
Yeah,
in a
freeloading for sure.
because that's a huge topic. But trying to get them adequately preloaded without having them just needing to go to the bathroom the whole time, that
Mm.
was one thing. And then also, obviously, between practice sessions over the course of a weekend, and that making sure that they're just trying to maintain body weight and stay well hydrated in between sessions. So you can
Yeah.
start a 3 day weekend of racing in good shape, but if you get progressively dehydrated because of the environment between sessions, then the important race is on the Sunday, and that's when you've got to get in the car topped up.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of emphasis on getting pre-hydrated. And
Yeah,
then with
because it's not like you can pee in the car. Well, I guess you can pee in your suit, I suppose, like
yeah
triathletes do.
yeah
I
yeah
guess you have
well, it
to.
probably happens more often than they would admit. I've seen it, when they take their take their overalls off and stuff. But yeah, it's that in itself is like an uncomfortable and not a pleasant experience. So most people
Yeah.
want to avoid that. We all know the feeling of like driving our own cars and needing a bathroom break that we can't have.
Yeah.
Well, imagine doing that at 200 miles an hour. It's
Yeah,
just
no
not. It's
thanks.
not going to be. It's not going to be nice. It's another thing to detract from what you're doing. So it's always
Yeah.
finding that balance.
Yeah. And I in the show you see them all like waiting in a line. I guess they're weighing themselves. What are they doing when they're like waiting in a line after the race?
They all
Do
get
they have to
weighed
take
in.
weight? They wait.
Yes, they
Okay.
do. They get weighed in and out because the combined car and person weight. There is a weight limit to what they need to hit. of what they need to hit. So that takes into account them,
Ah,
it's the car. So
got it. So yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that because when I was down the, Formula One rabbit hole on the internet after watching the show, I think I read somewhere that at one point there was a lot of pressure for drivers to keep their weight down to, keep, I guess, the overall car weight down with the driver. But now there's a weight requirement. Is that right? So, something happened to ease that pressure, so they're not like starving themselves, basically.
a little bit. I think what it certainly used to be, and I'm not exactly sure. I'm not 100% up to date on the latest
Yeah.
regulations, but we worked a lot with a driver called Mark Webber, an Australian driver who's very, very good, very, very dedicated athlete. And Mark, very tall for a Formula One driver, so he's probably, I don't know if Mark's 6 foot tall, but he's certainly
Oh wow.
much bigger than he's bigger. I'm 5'9" and he's taller than me, and that's
Mm,
unusual for drivers because the car has to be like he has to be flexible to get in the car because of the length of it, but also it's obviously challenging because effectively if you've got this total weight limit for the car and the driver, if the driver's lighter, the engineers can put weight exactly where they want it in the car and
mm,
more of it. Whereas if the driver's heavy, that reduces their opportunity to optimally weight the car. So the pressure from the team on the driver was always to hit relatively light body weights, which is fine for some people, but some people respond badly to that kind of, negatively
yeah.
to that kind of thing. And it sort of certainly was the case with Mark. And he and I have talked about this since that he got to the point. It wasn't kind of certainly nothing like eating disorder for him. It was very performance orientated, but he was very keen to train a lot and eat sparingly to keep his weight down because he could see a pure performance benefit coming from that. And I think with hindsight, that's one of the things that he's spoken about before, to say, look, it was probably went a bit far, at times. He was
Yeah.
training very,
Yeah.
very hard and eating very, very sort of inverted commas clean and a bit almost over obsessive. Although,
Yeah.
having said that, and having worked with Mark for a lot of years, one of the characteristics that made him great was the fact that he is a dedicated. He was like first in the building, last to leave. He's one of the hardest training athletes I've worked with in any sport, and so
Mhm.
there's always that kind of balancing of those two things. But certainly, the pressure on drivers was, and probably still is to a degree, is like lighter is better, because from an engineering perspective, you're a moving and non-compliant piece of mass they've got to deal with in the car.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes sense to a degree, but there's such a fine line between, at what point though does that hurt performance and harm your training and the adaptations that you know, your body's able to make because you're under fueling essentially. I mean, it's just such a very fine line, and the line
Definitely.
between eating for performance and disordered eating, because I think there is some level of disordered eating sometimes when it becomes more obsessive and all that. But that's a topic for another day. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for spending half of our time on this and letting me pick your brain about some of this, because again, I don't know very much about it, and it's just I find it so amazing. I was searching
No,
around
it's
the
all
internet. I'm
good.
like, I wonder if there is a dietitian who specifically works with the drivers. I found someone who, like, I think is in the UK, and I was like, oh, this is very
Yeah.
interesting. But anywho, all right. We're going to move
Yeah.
on to today's main topic, hydration, which is, of course, your area of expertise. So just to start out, I want to just start with some real basic stuff, just to understand the physiology behind sweat during exercise and the role that sodium plays in all of this. And then we can kind of move on to some specific situations and strategies so that listeners can leave this episode with some helpful takeaways to apply to their own training and racing. So, yeah, let's begin with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good place to start. So the real starting point, I suppose, is that core body temperature management is a key is a key task for the body during endurance exercise, because we all know that when you start running, cycling, whatever you're doing, even if it's on quite a cold day, you will start to get hot pretty quickly, and that's because obviously your muscles produce a lot of energy, a lot as heat, and that needs to be offloaded to the external environment because your core body temperature can only work within a very narrow range. Otherwise, you get ill and die pretty fast. So, sweating, the evaporation of water, off the surface of the skin is anyone who's got out of a swimming pool, an open air swimming pool, even on a hot day, will know that you immediately feel cold because of that evaporation of water from the surface of the skin. So it's a massively effective mechanism for shedding heat. And so over the millennia, our bodies have obviously optimized that and become very adept at sweating so that we can perform exercise in hot environments. And so the way sweating works is the hypothalamus in your brain detects a rise in core body temperature. At a critical threshold, it turns on the sweat glands and gets them to take water from your blood plasma, and you leach it out into the skin. It evaporates away and heat goes with it. And of course, the benefit of that is that your core temperature stops rising or is managed, but the downside is that you lose water. And also, because your blood plasma from where sweat is drawn is very, very salty, it contains 3,600 milligrams of sodium in every litre, you inevitably lose some of that electrolyte as well. So over time, if you don't replace the fluid and if you don't replace the electrolyte, the sodium, you start to get a substantial drop in blood volume, which is probably the biggest reason why, well, it is the biggest reason why dehydration hurts endurance performance, because you essentially you sweat out some of your blood volume, and then your cardiovascular system is under a lot more pressure to deliver, and you have to slow down.
Yes, thanks for that explanation. So, so you kind of just described a bit about what's happening in the body when dehydration is occurring. But how can and so I guess like the question is, what happens in the body when dehydration or overhydration occurs? But I guess the bigger question is, what point do either of these really impact performance? And I guess it also depends on the situation, right? Climate, duration,
Yeah.
intensity. But maybe you can walk us through a bit of that.
Yeah, that's where I suppose it gets a bit more complicated and interesting, because we know for sure if you start at the extreme ends of the spectrum, if you start with, rather than dealing with overhydration and dehydration together, if we take dehydration and say, look, at some point, most athletes at some point, either usually by accident, have got dehydrated enough to feel what it feels like to hurt your performance. And you know that what you tend to see with dehydration hurting performance is, initially, if you try and maintain an exercise intensity, it gets harder, it feels harder. You can feel like the perceived exertion goes up, so you feel like it's a lot harder to maintain a pace. Your heart rate probably go up quite significantly because you've got less blood that you're pumping around, and sooner or later you'll get very thirsty, and sooner or later you're forced to slow down if you don't get a drink, because those things become overwhelming, and so your cardiovascular function, your ability to offload heat, is really compromised. And that's what happens when you are not allowed to, or you cannot access fluids during exercise. And this is what was shown in a lot of early trials of dehydration that they did in labs, was they would exercise people and not allow them to drink, and then show how catastrophic that was for performance. And I think initially, when those studies were done in the sort of 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they were quite often held up to demonstrate the fact that, if we, dehydration, even a modest amount of dehydration, like 2% of body weight loss, can compromise performance quite significantly. And that was, for a long time, that was a really widely held belief, that there's this kind of threshold around 2% of body weight loss that would, beyond which dehydration would, kick in and catastrophically affect performance. But then, subsequent to that, over a number of years, that idea got challenged, because quite a few people observed that, in actual fact, athletes aren't very often in a position where they're forced not to drink. If you give athletes access to fluids, they'll tend to drink when they're thirsty, and therefore they won't just forcibly dehydrate, and their performance won't drop off. And then that was further sort of elaborated on with studies that looked at marathon runners in particular, but also triathletes and other endurance athletes, and noticed that some of the top performers especially were finishing races in fast times without any serious degradation of performance, and they were losing 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 7% of their body weight through dehydration, but weren't slowing down. A really famous example of that was the marathon runner Haile Gebrselassie, who ran, I think it was like a 2:04 marathon, and lost 7% of his body weight from start to finish.
Wow.
And he drank quite a lot during that race actually, but had
Mm.
such a phenomenal sweat rate and such a high work rate that he dropped. And this then caused the sort of a bit of a rethink, as saying, well, actually, maybe there's not a threshold we can say beyond which categorically performance is going to be impaired if you lose X amount of body fluid, but that so then and that, as you pointed out, is very situational dependent. It's dependent. I think there's going to be individual variance in that. Some people can
Hmm.
seemingly tolerate more dehydration than others without a problem. There's going to be situations like lower intensities of exercise, cooler conditions, when there's less stress on your cardiovascular system anyway. Maybe a higher level of dehydration is less impactful directly on your performance immediately. And then the other factor is, like, how do you measure dehydration really accurately? Because we might see a 5 or 6% body weight drop in an athlete like Gabriel Selassie in a marathon, but is that drop representative of them actually becoming 5 or 6% dehydrated, as it were? Because when you start a marathon, most of us will have carb loaded. That puts your starting body weight up a bit. It holds fluid with it.
Mm.
You might have taken on
Hmm.
additional sodium. I know that I used to start an Ironman at least, 2, 3, maybe even 4 pounds heavier than my regular weight because of the amount of extra food and fluid I'd taken on beforehand, which then allows you to have like a bigger body weight drop before dehydration is even a problem. So
Mm.
it's a difficult one. We've actually, I don't know if you've seen the blog that we've put on our site about like how much dehydration can I tolerate before my performance suffers, and
Oh, I
I
didn't see
suppose
that one.
it's kind of expands on that question quite a lot and gives some examples. But what I would say is that the summary there is, it's like, we know at some point dehydration definitely affects performance. That point is going to be situationally dependent and individually dependent, though. But for
Mm.
most people, it probably is when you get to somewhere between 2 and 5% of body weight drop. If that goes uncorrected, you're likely to suffer when it comes to endurance performance, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're really focusing more on the longer stuff in this case, right? Because I've heard you
Yeah,
say in another podcast that it's, if you're doing 90 minutes or less, hydration is not really limiting performance. Is that correct?
I would say as long as you start that bout of exercise well hydrated, that's absolutely
Yeah.
true. Because very few
Yeah.
athletes, we've worked with 1 or 2 athletes who have such phenomenal sweat rates that they can lose 3.5 liters of fluid per hour during exercise. And
Whoa.
for
Yeah.
those guys, you can maybe start to see a degradation after 90 minutes, but
Yeah.
for the vast majority of people, as long as you focus on getting to the start line of your training session or your race, if it's 90 minutes or less, well hydrated, then just drinking a bit if you feel like it is probably a good enough strategy in most cases.
Yeah.
It's when
Yeah.
stuff gets longer, like you were talking about. Obviously, you're interested in ultras and that kind of thing, and they can go on some of those 100 milers and stuff. They can be, especially if they're in the mountains, they're easily
Mm.
20 odd plus hours, and that's where it becomes a whole different game.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see, just as a sports dietitian, the sports nutrition guidelines are still like, oh, let's keep to 2 to 3% body weight loss and all of those.
Yeah,
Those are the things that we're supposed to recommend. And it's interesting. Of course, we know that in real life we see other things, and especially among elite athletes. But yeah, that's all really interesting. So thanks for that. What about overhydration? Let's talk through what happens in the body when we overhydrate and what exactly that means and how that impacts performance.
yeah. So overhydration is definitely something I've got unfortunately got some personal first-hand experience of, because
Oh,
when I know that I used to, and I'd still do if I exercise, sweat a lot. And so one of the first things I did when my performance was tanking in long hot races was double down and drink more, because I assumed that I was becoming dehydrated, so I'd drink more. And the problem, if you drink lots and lots of fluid, certainly anything approaching or exceeding your sweat rate during exercise, and if that fluid is low, either has no sodium if it's water, or if it's a sports drink with low sodium content, it's very easy for you to start to dilute your blood sodium levels down. And just like your core body temperature, blood sodium levels are regulated really tightly by the body. And if you go out of whack with that, there's a pretty strong penalty to pay. You can make yourself quite ill, because what the body does, if you dilute the sodium levels in the blood, and you can't pee out enough fluid to balance it out, because your kidneys do most of the regulation, you end up pushing fluid from the bloodstream, from the extracellular compartment into the intracellular compartment. And that causes cells to swell. And that might cause you to have puffy ankles and puffy fingers. But if it goes to your brain, if you start to get your brain cells swelling, it can cause all sorts of cognitive disturbance, headaches, and nausea and sickness. And if it really goes unchecked, it can put you in a coma or even kill you. And I'm sure you'll be well aware there are unfortunately still, deaths every now and then from hyponatremia
Mm,
in long
yeah.
distance endurance events, and they're mostly attributable to people over consuming fluid because they're afraid of getting dehydrated. So it's kind of fluid overload is as bad, if not worse, than dehydration, because it can also, if once you start to fluid overload and get out of control with it, the signs and symptoms, most people aren't familiar with them, and I certainly wasn't. And I would double down and drink more and more, and then end up in a really bad way. And I had hyponatremia a couple of times. Luckily, it made me nothing more than ill for a couple of days, and then it
Mm,
self-corrected. But I do look back at some of the volumes that I was drinking with a bit of horror these days, because they were just unnecessary and sort of ill. It was ill conceived. I needed to actually take more electrolytes and drink less fluid, and then that would have allowed everything to stay in much more of a decent homeostatic balance. So
yeah.
we we I don't know if you've come across it a lot, but one of the areas we've seen a lot of problems with overhydration. It does happen during events, but I think it happens even more frequently in the immediate build up to events, when
Hmm.
all of a sudden athletes who don't typically feel like they drink enough go into overdrive, 48 hours before a major event, and start drinking loads of water, especially if it's hot, especially if it's long, and there have been numerous studies have shown that on the start lines of some hot ultra marathons and Ironman triathlons, you can get a fair percentage of the field starting with mild hyponatremia. So starting already a little bit pre-diluted because they've drunk so much water in the build-up. And
Yeah.
we've got countless, anecdotal cases of that happening, where I think that's still an educational message that needs pushing harder to athletes, is that you fluid loading is not like glycogen loading. You can't just up your intake for 2 or 3 days before the event and expect to be all great. Your body will self-correct. It will pee out a lot of that additional fluid. It will flush minerals out with that and electrolytes out with that, and you'll end up actually worse off rather than better off when you get to the start.
Yeah. And I think it's not helped by the fact that a lot of public messaging surrounding sodium, for instance, staying under 2,300 milligrams per day, per the
Yeah.
government guidelines, or the perception that food is unhealthy because it's higher in sodium, like that doesn't help with the discussions that we have with athletes.
No,
Um,
I mean, to give you a
so
really
yeah.
direct example on that, I think we worked out that in some of the hotter Ironman races, I could have been losing as much as 23,000 milligrams of sodium in a race,
Yeah.
let alone 2,300. And then you run into this problem. If you're at 2,300, you're actually so severely under replacing what you're losing, you would end up in catastrophic trouble. And you're right that the public health messaging around that is not. It probably isn't erroneous for a lot of people who are relatively sedentary and have a lot of sodium in their diet, but for athletes, we're a bit more of a special case. And
Mm,
certainly salty foods, putting salt on your foods to taste when you're in heavy training, and certainly in the summer when it's hot and you're doing a lot of sweating, all of that stuff I think is good advice for helping to maintain sodium balance and not skimping on it.
yeah. Just out of curiosity, have you ever worked or tested or worked with athletes who have hypertension? Um, but they're training for, significant enough events, like endurance events, that they have to really worry about obviously replacing electrolytes and all of that.
Yes, yeah, we get quite a few questions about that, and it's a difficult one to navigate in one sense,
Mm,
because we're not physicians, we don't pretend to be, and
yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't cut across the advice that physicians would give. But where we've had productive discussions with athletes and physicians who are dealing with them, it's been that, look, the problem really with sodium, and the reason for sodium being people being advised to cut down in it if they have hypertension, is that they're probably in a net sodium, they're probably taking in more sodium than they're excreting. So
Sure.
that when you're an athlete training, if you can go some way towards quantifying your sodium losses during exercise and aim to replace a reasonable proportion of them either during or before and after exercise, you're not putting yourself in, and you're not increasing your sodium load over and above what you're otherwise sweating out. So it ought to be a sensible thing to do, because otherwise you run the risk of going the other way and creating too much of a deficit and an unmanageable deficit for the body. So it needs careful management, and it's definitely something which athletes with hypertension should work through with their physician, because sometimes medication for high blood pressure can be in the form of diuretics and things, which further messes up the sodium balance. And it's a complicated and very individual picture, but I think I'd feel comfortable and confident in saying that just don't assume, if you're an athlete who's training hard and long, doing long sessions, especially in the heat, and you have high blood pressure, it's not necessarily a slam dunk that you need to minimize sodium intake. It might actually be the opposite during those periods of heavy load.
Yeah, exactly. I've had a couple clients in this category, and it definitely is a much more complicated discussion, and definitely those types of athletes would highly benefit from sodium testing and being able to really dial that piece in. But I was just curious. Okay, so the next question I have, aside from playing a key role in fluid retention, sodium is also involved in nutrient absorption, and GI issues are, of course, a super common complaint among endurance athletes, and especially more extreme conditions. So, again, from a more physiology standpoint, can you just explain how GI distress is linked to various hydration issues?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, because you're right. GI distress is a leading cause of upset and DNFs, or bad experiences in long endurance events. And I've been on the receiving end of that, and it's unpleasant, especially when you feel a bit cheated when you've done the hard work, you put the hard training miles in, and then actually it's not your fitness that lets you down. And so one of the biggest issues, I think, is that if you're trying to fuel relatively, the trend these days, which I'm in agreement with, is to try to fuel relatively aggressively during long endurance events with carbohydrates, because they support a high level of output. But in order to be able to do that, you need to be able to absorb those carbohydrates in the small intestine. And obviously, with blood flow being shunted away because you're exercising, if you get dehydrated, if you don't get your sodium balance right in what you're drinking, it can compromise that blood flow and the movement of water through the gut, and then further compromise absorption of what you're eating. And then what you get is that horrible bloated, sicky stomach, and you end up with all sorts of GI problems. And sometimes people think it's because they've eaten too much, but actually it might be because they've eaten too much in relation to what they've consumed in terms of fluid and sodium. I've definitely had the case where I've been quite bloated in a race in my stomach, and found that I've taken on probably too much water, and then added some sodium in the form of some salt capsules or something like that, and almost that acts like a drain, and it clears the stomach, because you get the balance, the osmotic gradient back, and then the gut can absorb some sodium and fluid, and it starts to clear, and you start to feel better. So it's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance that works for you. But it can be incredibly hard, especially in hot weather, because let's be honest, especially if you're training for an ultra or an Ironman or something like that, how often do you push yourself that far and that hard in those kind of hot conditions? So you don't always have a bit of a personal database of experience to draw on to tell you how much you need to take and that sort of thing, which I think is where kind of testing and modeling and working through it with a practitioner like yourself, or speaking to some of the guys in my team, that's the kind of that's the kind of way to help unpick that and give you a bit of a sense of the direction in which you might be wanting to go to improve the situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the hard part too is, like, on the other side, like, let's say you take in too much sodium for what you're excreting, then you also get like nausea or something. So it's like on either end of it. It's just it's always so hard to strike that balance. And I talk with my clients all the time. And as you said, for people who are doing really long stuff, let's say you're training for 100-miler, and your problems only start like after 50 miles or something. It's so hard to replicate that. And Yeah, so it's really really tricky stuff, and we all just do our best trying to figure it out. But as much as we can take guesswork out with testing and such, it's super super
Well,
helpful.
the
All right.
thing,
Oh, sorry. Go
the
ahead.
thing with
Hmm.
that, I was just going to say, because that you made a
Hmm.
really good, a really valid point, which is that kind of thing that during an event, people sometimes do go from taking very little to too much and that kind of thing, because they
Mm,
assume that if I'm a bit dehydrated, what I need to do is slam 6 bottles of water, or
yeah.
if I'm a bit crampy and low on sodium, I need to take 25 salt tablets or whatever,
Yeah.
because if one's good, like more
Yeah. Yeah.
more will be better. And that
Yeah.
concept of kind of the Goldilocks amount, the kind of not too little but not too much, is a really fine balance. And I suppose the way that, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this because you coach a lot of people in this area, but the way we try and describe it to people is saying, look, when you do a long, hot and hard event, what you should be doing is going into it with a plan for and
Yes.
knowing three numbers really really well. Those numbers are roughly how much um, how much carbohydrate do I need to take in per hour. You
Yep.
need to know roughly how much fluid you need to take in per hour, and sort of index linked to that, roughly how much sodium do I need to take per hour. And
Exactly.
then
Yeah.
as the race unfolds, you kind of start with the plan, and the first period, maybe it's the first hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is, proportional to the length of the race. You roll that plan out. You kind of stick with it and you go with it, but as it develops, you got to start listening to the feedback your body's giving you. Am I
Mm,
feeling more thirsty than I expected? Is it hotter than I expected? I thought I was going to need 16 ounces of fluid an hour, but what I'm now learning is that maybe I need 20. And then
hmm.
if you know what you were trying to hit and what you've done in the past and what's worked, you can reliably tweak that dial up a little bit on the fly and move the sodium up with it, and then see if that helps to correct. And it could be the same with the carbs. Or literally spoke to an athlete today who said to me that he's a very good athlete. He's qualified for the Hawaii Ironman, and he said that he felt like he wasn't taking enough energy and carbs in previous races. So in his last race, he had put a load of energy gels in a water bottle, and he had about 400 grams of carbohydrate in there, and he reckons he ate all of that in the first 2.5 hours of the bike ride
Oh
on
wow.
a race, and then said how lousy he felt. And it was like, yeah, yeah, you went from taking like not taking enough to suddenly taking
Yeah.
one and a half to two
Gut
times
training.
what you
Two
actually
words.
needed.
Gut
Yeah,
training.
yeah. Gut training you need to build up to it. And so
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't emphasize enough that, like, having a handle on what those numbers roughly should be for you based on the event, your physiology, conditions. And then we use this phrase, we call it like a mental ledger. And throughout the event, I always encourage athletes to think on an hourly basis, like, how much roughly did I have in the last hour or the last couple of hours? Am I way below my targets? Am I above my targets? And how am I feeling? Because if you start feeling lousy and you're way above your targets, the chances are throwing more in of anything is not going to help. You're probably going to need to actually back off, take less, and slow your pace and wait for your body to settle a little bit. If, on the other hand, you've only taken 50% of what your plan suggested, maybe the place to go looking is to increase your intake, because you've been under fueling or under hydrating. But if you're like me 15, 20 years ago, I just assumed that more was going to be better. If I was feeling rubbish for anything, it was like I need to put more of something in. And so I would be putting more water in, or more Coca-Cola in, or more sports drink, or more gels in, and just until basically you just overwhelm your system. And I still
Yeah.
see that today. It's just
Yeah.
kind of appreciating that more is not always better is a key concept.
Yeah, and I agree 100% with what you're saying. Like I take the same approach with my clients and with my own, training and racing, and just in terms of like setting out those targets. So that's spot on. Um, okay, let's revisit. I'm conscious of time. It looks like we're gonna go over. I'm sorry.
You're all
If you
good.
really have to go, you just let me know. We'll wrap it up. But I
Yeah,
just want to get
no,
through a
you're all
bit
good.
more. To make sure we have some kind of really specific strategies and takeaways. So just to kind of set the stage, can you give us a sense of what some of these ranges look like in terms of sweat rates and sodium losses, and what the averages are, just to kind of show just how extremely different they are from one person to the next.
Yeah, yeah, good place to start. So if we start with sodium loss in sweat is measured as a concentration. Usually, we're talking milligrams per liter. And we can, I guess, celebrate it up the idea that is around 3,600 milligrams of sodium per liter. Like a Gatorade, like that is usually about 500 milligrams sodium per liter. Um, the the range of sweat sodium loss is massive. It could be, some people we see losing as little as 200 or 300 milligrams of sodium per liter, so they would have very, very lightly salty sweat, right up to people who lose over 2,000 milligrams sodium per liter of sweat, and they're extremely salty. The average is
Mm.
somewhere in the middle. It's around about 950 milligrams per liter, and for those people that know anything about data and statistics, it's kind of a bell-shaped curve. So that
Mm.
means that in the middle of that range, the vast majority of people will sit just one around the average, just one side of the other. And as you get out closer towards the extremes, you see less and less examples. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm up at 1,800 milligrams a liter, which puts me in is a bit of towards the outliers on the higher end. And sometimes
Hmm.
we test athletes who are down at 300 milligrams per liter, and they're
Wow.
outliers at the lower end. And they're,
Yeah.
interestingly, very small digression, but often those people are pretty good at performing in the heat. Not always, clearly, but
Hmm.
I've
Hmm.
definitely seen a slight trend in that towards some of the really elite athletes that we've worked with who are very good in the heat. Very few of them have above average sweat sodium losses.
Yeah. I'm so curious to get myself tested because I definitely, I mean, I sweat, but I don't sweat that much. But I do love, like, I get thirsty and I love to drink. I love to
Yeah,
drink water. I love to drink, so it's really interesting. So I'm not like sopping wet, but I love to drink. And I don't think I'm a salty sweater, but again, like, I'm so fascinated by all this. I really am curious to
yeah.
get what my
Well,
results will end up being when I get myself tested.
we
Um,
definitely need to make that happen. Yeah,
yeah,
and then
for sure.
you combine that sort of sweat sodium loss with sweat rates, and obviously sweat
Yeah,
rates vary
yeah,
a lot as well. And
of
the
course.
if we start in the middle with that one, you'd probably say really hard to put an average figure, because clearly exercise intensity and environment play a
Sure.
huge factor. But if I've often seen quoted, and I kind of inclined to agree, that something around 1 litre, or sort of 32, 34 ounces an hour, is a reasonably average sweat rate for an adult endurance athlete exercising at a decent intensity.
Mm.
That's kind of a middle point. The range on that
Mhm,
is
mhm.
pretty spectacular as well. We sometimes see
Yeah.
people who lose like 200 or 300 milliliters. So what's that? That's like
Nothing.
6 ounces an hour. They're like
Yeah.
they are the people that figuratively glow and don't really sweat.
Yeah.
And interestingly, those people sometimes really struggle in the heat because they can't cool down effectively enough. They have to throw tons of
Yeah.
water over themselves because the body doesn't produce enough sweat, and that can be a problem. But then on the other end, we've seen large male, in particular professional athletes in different sports, losing in excess of 3.5 liters per hour of sweat. So I've certainly seen NFL players losing more than 3.5 liters an hour. I've seen NBA
Mm.
players. So in the last couple of years, we've worked with a pretty high profile tennis player, who loses 3.7 liters an hour of sweat, which is an
Wow.
insane body fluid
Yeah.
to lose.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
unreal. And
Yeah.
but like with the, probably even more extreme than with the bell curve around sweat sodium, there's a big grouping in the middle. So most people are going to be losing probably between, I don't know, 800 milliliters and 13 or 1400 milliliters an hour during exercise if they're going at a reasonable intensity. It'll obviously skew upwards when the weather gets hotter, and it'll
Mhm.
skew upwards when it's cooler, but
Mhm.
that's kind of a sensible amount. And
Got it.
you might have seen the blog on our site, and I'm sure you've done it with people, but measuring that is pretty easy to do. You can weigh
Yeah.
yourself after some training
Yep.
sessions. It's an interesting thing to do. You can get a handle on what your individual losses are like if you do that.
Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of the next question is, really, so as we've talked about, in order to create a successful hydration plan that is individual to each athlete, we need to know the sweat rate, or how much fluid is lost an hour per hour, and how much sodium is lost in the sweat. So, starting with the sweat rate, because that's really the easy part of testing. Anyone with access to a scale can do it. So, maybe you can just briefly explain the basics of the test, and more importantly, how to apply these results to training racing, because I think that's where most people get really lost and confused, is like, okay, we have these results, now what? What do I do
Yeah.
with this? So, or they just don't do it at all, and then they're just like kind of shooting in the dark. But let's say, yeah, we have this test, and then what?
Yeah, so to do a sweat rate test, like you say, you weigh yourself before a training session or a race, you weigh yourself again afterwards, and you account for food that you've eaten and fluid that you've drunk, because obviously that is not going to that's going to skew the results, but it's easy to do. You just work out the volumes um, and take it off the total, and you you end up with a figure of body weight loss, which is largely going to be fluid loss through sweat. Because during any
Yeah.
normal exercise bout, you're not going to have burned enough fat or anything like that to make a difference to your mass, or not a significant difference. So you get this figure which equates to roughly 1 kilo of body weight loss is about 1 liter of fluid loss. And the I think the best way to go about doing this is to gather lots of data points over a period of time. If you're a runner, you might do it in different weather conditions, in different running at different intensities, and start to bash them all into a spreadsheet. If you're not very good with spreadsheets, we've got one you can download from our website. It's free. You just pull it down, put your data in, your pre and post body weights and things, and it will work it all out for you. And then over time, you can sort of start to see trends and see, well, if I run for 90 minutes and I usually lose, let's say, 1.5 liters an hour. 1.5 liters. That's about 1 liter per hour. If that's in cool weather conditions, what does that suddenly look like if I go somewhere hot and humid? Do the same thing. Maybe does that double? Does it go up by 50%? And you just build up this kind of database. And I always say to people that no one sweat test can tell you a huge amount. It can indicate where you might be on the scale, but the power comes in like having a mass of data and really understanding what your sweat rate is like, and then you can compare what your averages are like to those normal figures. If I'm significantly north of 1.5 to 2 liters per hour, often I am going to classify myself as like a heavy sweater, and therefore one of my challenges, especially if I'm going to suddenly go and race in hot and humid conditions, is going to be keeping up with fluid loss. Whereas if I'm down at 700 or 800 milliliters an hour, maybe and maybe my approach to fluid replacement can be a little bit more relaxed, and a bit more responsive to thirst, because I'm less likely to accrue a massive deficit in the race, because my sweat rate is probably more compatible with the rate of what I can absorb in my gut. And so it's one of those things where people I think naively think that you can do a sweat test and then punch numbers into a spreadsheet and get an output that tells you what you need to do. But it's a lot more touchy feely than that. You've got to get to understand your body, and it just gives you an idea. The other sweat test that I quite like people doing, it uses exactly the same technique, but you don't really what you look at is you look at performance and heart rate and things with your normal habits, and then you deliberately modify your hydration regime. So you either drink more so that you lose less body weight, or you drink less so you lose more body weight, and see how that impacts your performance. Because if you control the other variables like the intensity and the duration and the temperature, you can really get a sense for whether what you are currently doing is going to benefit from you taking on more or less, which is a really important indicator as to where you're at. It just, unfortunately, it just requires lots of repetitive testing, which is something that I've typically found a lot of people aren't necessarily all that motivated to do.
I can usually get my clients to do at least 2 or 3, because I'm always encouraging them to do, in different. I mean, even if it's in the same environment, but just to kind of test a few times to get, again, more information, right? And compare and contrast. If it's pretty consistent, great. But even also over the course of a training cycle, as they become fitter and maybe the weather's changing or whatever it is. So I mean, it's such an
Definitely.
easy test to do. Why not? You don't have to pay for it. It's there as long as you have a scale. So it's like, what's the downside? It's like you may as well.
Definitely. You
So
learn
you're
something.
basically
Yeah.
saying that you're not usually giving like a range of, oh, you should be aiming to do X percent to this percent of roughly what your losses are. You're typically not doing something like that. Is that correct?
Not yes. I typically don't give really hard ranges out, but what I will say to people is, look, if they're consistently, say, showing up at 3 or 4% dehydrated after training sessions, I will definitely be nudging them to say, look, let's see if you do increase your drinking to this and keep it down below 2%. Does that improve
Hmm.
things? Do you recover faster?
Yeah.
Do you feel better? Because it's really hard because of the individual variance. It's always really
Yeah.
hard to be definitive with people and say, I think we try and look at the whole picture, and then s- the starting point for me is always not that we know better than what the athlete's doing. Most athletes who've
Mm.
got a reasonable amount of experience do the things they do for a reason. Those reasons might not always be sound, but they do them, and they often kind of essentially basically work. So if you use what the athlete's doing at the moment as that starting point, that basis, you measure their body weights, you see how much they're losing. It's pretty obvious that if they're losing 5 or 6%, you're probably going to get an improvement by nudging them to drink more and reduce that deficit. I would say, you're almost certainly going to see better recovery and things like that, even if you don't see better performance in the session. But when people are already in that, say, like 1 to 3% range, on a rare occasion, you might get people who are at 1%, and that's over drinking for them, because actually their body, will deal better with a little bit more dehydration. They're overwhelming their gut. So there's always that kind of element of needing to look at it on a case by case basis, which sounds like a way of evading your question, but I just, I just,
No,
I
I
don't like,
totally understand.
I don't like the idea of
I
simple,
totally get it.
simple
Yeah.
answers where
Yeah.
they can't be applied.
I know. No, I know, and I mean, this is always my struggle, especially because like, I'll have listeners send questions to me, and so much of the time, I feel like I'm not answering the question because it's like, "Well, it depends." You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah,
And but
yeah,
it's really true, it really depends, and I think, again, this is such a huge and confusing topic to so many people, and, you know, it's I want people to be able to listen and take something away that's like, "Great, I'm gonna try this," and it's just not really black and white and clear cut all the time. So, I mean, we can use these tests, right, to kind of get a sense of things, a ballpark about, well, why don't we aim for this? I mean, would you even say, like, let's start by replenishing at least half of this? Or it's, again, it's not even that. It's more, okay, well, let's look at how much body weight. And as you said, kind of, you have all these
yeah.
inputs. And I'm trying to simplify a little bit, I guess you could say. I don't know if you can
Yeah,
try,
I
is there
would
a way to
say
simplify?
I think there is, in the sense that if someone puts a gun to my head or my head on a block and says, like, what numbers do you think are going to work for a lot of people a lot of the time, I would say, if you're outside of 3 or 4% body weight deficit routinely when you're doing exercise sessions, especially if you're
Yeah.
training hard, training twice a day, training daily, and that sort of thing, and if there's room for you to increase your fluid and sodium intake during those sessions in order to bring that down to, say, more like 3 to 2% or 2 to 1% or something like that, I would say that is a reasonable direction in which for most people to move,
Yeah.
because we know that what you're dealing with is that exercise is a big disruptor to your homeostasis, and part of that is the fluid imbalance. If you lose 3 or 4 or 5% of your body weight, that's going to take quite a few hours, if not a day or two, to get back into sync, and
Yeah.
that's going to affect what you do afterwards. And that's why we have very different guidelines for, like, rehydration post exercise for people who are training twice or 3 times a day than we do for people who are training
Mhm.
2 or 3 times a week. Because if
Sure.
you get really dehydrated on a Monday, but your next serious training session isn't until Thursday, you'll self correct. Your instincts will drive you to consume more sodium or fluid, and you can bet with most people they will just turn up on Thursday back in balance. But if you do that to yourself on Monday morning, and then you've got a hard training session Monday evening, you're going to have to be more proactive, both in the session and between the sessions, to correct for that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
probably one way of looking at it.
Thank you. One more thing before we move to the sodium piece. Let's chat about drinking to thirst versus on a schedule. And again, I know this is something you talked about in other shows, but we're going to revisit here because it's an important one. This
Yeah,
whole concept of thirst, and
yeah.
we know it's not always reliable, and but at the same time, we do want to listen to our body. So when how do you handle this?
I'd say if you function normally, as in terms of your brain function and your thirst instinct, then drinking to thirst will, in almost all circumstances, will certainly stop you from dying during exercise. And if the weather's cool and if you've not got a huge sweat rate, it will enable you to perform and function at a decent level. Um, where it starts to fall down is when you've got very, very high sweat losses over multiple hours, and like things like a 50-mile ultra marathon or an Ironman triathlon, and then if you simply rely on thirst, there are athletes that do and they perform well, but there are a lot of athletes that do and they don't perform well because their thirst
Yeah.
instincts kick in relatively late, and when it's too late, and when the horse has bolted, and so
Yeah.
having a plan there's very few athletes we advocate having a rigid plan, sticking to it. Most athletes, it's
Yeah.
kind of a plan that they follow for the first few hours and then sort of go by feel, listening to their, how they're. One big piece around that is like when you get a few hours in, are the electrolytes and the sodium based drinks that you're taking in tasting good still, or are you craving plain water, for example? Because your body's pretty good at telling you
Mhm.
what it wants. And so I think having a plan is important for people with high sweat rates, and particularly those doing long and hot events, but it should still be a flexible plan which you adjust as you go. And it's probably a decent point at which to mention some of the case studies we've got on our website. I don't know if you've seen any of those,
Yeah,
have you?
I have. Those are
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
So there's one, if anyone's interested in this, if they go in and look at a particular case study with there's a couple on there now with a guy called Luke Henderson, who's an Ironman triathlete who has extreme sweat and sodium losses. And Luke takes in, well, Luke was advised for many years to drink to thirst, and every Ironman race he
Mm.
did, he ended up in the hospital, like literally to the point where I think his wife said, like, there's no more of this for you. This is not happening now.
Ugh.
We sweat tested him, and he had another independent sweat test to kind of verify it. He loses over 2,000 milligrams of sodium per liter and
Wow.
over 2 to 2.5 liters per hour routinely. And so we gave him a plan for one of his Ironman events, which was one of the most aggressive hydration and sodium replacement plans we've given anyone, to the point where I was nervous about actually recommending it's ridiculous numbers. But
Yeah, yeah.
when you look at it, he unfortunately, I'm quoting these numbers off the top of my head, and they may well not be entirely accurate to what's on the website, but it was well in excess of, I think, 1.3 liters per hour that he drank during this Ironman
Mm.
for 9 hours. He took well over 2,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid that he drank, and for the
Wow.
first time ever, crushed his race and did it
Yeah.
right. But it required an almost constant proactivity for him throughout the whole race to be drinking as much as he physically could and taking on as much sodium as he comfortably could. And that's
Yeah.
unusual, but that's the far extreme of what you're talking about. Is like if left and just said drink to thirst, that's a
Sure.
catastrophe for him. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
most people are a little bit further. Most people are lucky that they're a little bit further backed off on the spectrum than where Luke is, but it still means, I think, for long hot races, a plan is preferable to just drinking to thirst and winging it.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. All right, let's move to the sodium piece. This is, of course, a big part of your company, Precision Fuel and
Yeah.
Hydration. Um, can you just briefly explain how your test works? And I'm curious how, or I'm sure my listeners will be curious how it's different from companies like Levelin that use the sweat patches that you send in
Yeah.
via mail.
Yeah, so the sweat test that we do is done at rest, which surprises a lot of people. And still to this day, people, even though we have videos describing it, people show up at our offices with their kit ready to do a run or a bike or something, and they're often relieved to know all they've got to do is sit in a chair, because we use a chemical called pilocarpine, which stimulates the sweat glands and then causes you to sweat on a tiny part of your arm, and we can collect that sweat in a little sterile collector immediately. It takes about between 5 and 15 minutes normally, and then run that through an analyzer to measure the sodium concentration. And so you get a pretty quick result and a pretty accurate result. And exercise testing has some advantages in that you can often collect sweat rate at the same time. You do it in a controlled way, and that obviously it can be made very, very specific to the intensity and duration that you're intending to compete in. So the results are unambiguously going to be very accurate to what you lose in those conditions. But the interesting thing about sweat sodium is that it's relatively stable and fairly genetically influenced in an individual. So actually taking a spot sweat test at rest is certainly good enough to get you in the right zone for how much sodium you lose. And I think that is all you need to be. It's a bit like we always describe it to people, say it's a bit like getting your t-shirt size. You don't need to have this down to the nearest millimeter. You just need to know whether you're basically a small, a medium, a large, or an extra large. And then you can use that to start to make an estimation of how much sodium you might need to replace per hour when you're exercising.
Okay, awesome. And what about like the sweat patches? Like I've had clients use Levelin that because it's affordable and relatively easy. They can mail it in, stuff like that.
Yeah, you can. So sweat patch testing, when it's done really well, really in a controlled environment, can give some decent, accurate results. What we've typically seen with a lot of mail away tests and tests that people do at home is a big risk is getting evaporative loss of the sweat from the patch, and then it looks more concentrated. So we've seen
that's what happened to my client.
Yeah, we've seen it countless times with those kind of mail-in patches where people send us in a bit of a panic. They send us a result and say, I did this sweat patch test with the company and I sent it in the mail and they've said I lose like 2,800 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat. And we're like, well, we've only ever seen like 5 other people in the world who that's true for. Do a normal sweat test on them and they're like 1,100 or something. And I've seen enough of that to know that although the theory is sound, the practice of doing that stuff is really, really tricky. And so it sounds like I've got a dog in the fight here. We've got our method, other people have theirs.
Yes.
I don't think that patch testing is a bad method, but it needs to be done in controlled conditions with people who are very practiced at the art. I think mailing kits to people at home is a tough gig for people to get it right. And then you're in a whole world of trouble because if you take those results as gospel, you're going, you're barking up the wrong tree when it comes to what your level of investment needs to be.
Yeah, and I had people use these for a while, and I'm tempted to stop doing it, to be honest, because the last client I had he's an ultra runner, has like gut and other issues over, it's a perfect example of over 50 miles or whatever, or 50K, I forget which distance it was, but training for these really long things, it's everything, like the wheels fall off, but it's hard to replicate in training. Like he does fine up to a certain point, but huge amount of sweat loss, and is exercising in a very, very hot, humid environment. But he did a Levelin test, and so I have one more for you. It was 4,000 milligrams of sodium per hour is what it resulted. And I literally, like, he sent me the result and my like jaw dropped. I was like, holy shit. I don't even know what to do with this. Like, what? No. This can't be real. No, I mean, kind of freaked out and like reached out to all of my sports dietitian friends being like, I just got like really disturbing results. Like, what do I do?
I mean, it's crazy to me that there are companies out there that would produce a report like that and send it out without, it does make me wonder who's reading that stuff at the other end, before they send it out.
Yeah. But here's the interesting piece is I had another client who's also a very heavy sweater, and I think a salty sweater, do a result, or do the same test. And hers came back at, I think it was 2,000 something or other, right? But both were marked like level 5 severe. And I'm like, his was twice as much as yours.
Yeah.
Like this is not like, I don't know. So it's, again, this is why I really wanted to do this episode and bring more attention to this. And, it's again, just a very interesting area. And one of the things I want to talk about, just like we did with the sweat rate, is kind of like, okay, you do this test. Like, let's say you are able to locate one of your testing centers because you have them all over the place and do this test, now what? But I also, and we'll get there in a sec, like for someone who can't do this test, because it's not an option for everyone, let's be honest. No. So let's like go through that. Like, so let's say someone does your test, gets a really accurate result. what are the key strategies that you're passing along, to your clients with that result?
We're with that result, we're trying to give them, then we take a bunch of information about the type of activity they're doing so that we can understand
Hmm.
the likely environment, the duration and intensity, and also their fitness level. We get we either input their sweat rate if they've measured it, or at the very least a subjective rating of whether they're a light, moderate, heavy or very heavy sweater. And then we're really mostly trying to give them a steer on the concentration of the sports drink that they should be using,
Yeah.
with some level of guidance about the amount to drink. But actually it's more about getting the concentration right and then experimenting with different amounts until you dial the amount in, because the concentration tends to be pretty consistent for most people. It's the amount that you drink based on the demands of the event and the sweat, the sweat loss that you're experiencing, that really changes. So a
Yeah.
key output test is suggesting whether you're essentially in the bucket of being someone who needs either just water or a low strength sports drink, something that's high or something that's extremely high. And
Yeah.
then really the fun begins, the kind of individual trial and error to actually figure out and get it right. And that kind of organized trial and error piece is what we then try and support people with video
Hmm.
calls or with follow-up emails and that sort of stuff
Yeah.
when they report back on what they're doing. The people that find it most challenging, I would say, are the people who, if you live and train in a similar environment to that you regularly compete in, then you can build up lots of experience really quickly. The folks that
Hmm.
have the biggest trouble are those that, and I keep using triathlon examples, and I suppose actually I could use an ultra running example. So if you live in, the northeastern part of the US, but you're running Western States 100, it's
Sure.
really, really hot,
Perfect. Yeah.
then you're not going to get much experience at running in Western States like conditions. So you're
Yeah.
going to spend a lot of time having to extrapolate what you learn in cold conditions or cool conditions to what you might have to do in 100 degrees. And even with the best will in the world, that's very difficult to do. So,
Yeah.
it's then all about that, getting out in the environment and putting what the theory says into practice. Because ultimately that's the acid test. We do what we do. We do all of this stuff not to prove theories, but to improve performance. And sometimes, we had an interesting engagement with a few people on social media a few weeks ago because we put a case study out from a triathlete who drank very, very little during a very hot, high profile event, ate quite a lot of carbohydrate, but drank very little. And a lot of some people called us out saying these numbers can't be right. You couldn't possibly eat that much carbohydrate, that only amount of fluid. And I was like, well, we've got like 5 case studies on this person. This is what they do, and it works. And what's more, they win pretty much every time they turn up. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes the theory doesn't always, you know, it doesn't always adequately explain it. But I definitely think that when you get your numbers, as it were, sweat rate, sweat
Yeah.
sodium, whatever,
Yeah.
the next step is then, okay, like gain practical experience using that data to nudge you in the direction it suggests you should go.
Yeah. Yeah. And what if sodium testing is not an option for someone? Maybe you can take us through some of the signs that you may or may not be a salty sweater and how you would approach electrolyte replenishment in this case.
Yeah, I think if you think you might be a salty sweater, then you're looking for signs like, do you see salt marks on your skin and clothing after exercise? I certainly did. If sweat gets in your eyes, does it if sweat gets in your eyes, does it sting horribly? Or if you get cuts and things, grazes, does it sting in those? Do you get like episodes regularly in the heat? Do you get episodes of low blood pressure where you stand up fast and you feel faint and dizzy, which can be associated with electrolyte loss and blood volume
Hmm.
contraction? Do you get muscle cramps often? That's a whole, another contentious rabbit hole that we could or couldn't
Yeah,
go
we
down.
won't
But
go there today.
yeah. But in my experience, there is certainly a reasonably large percentage of muscle cramps in endurance activities can be traced to electrolyte imbalance. So
Yeah.
that's often a big red flag. All of those kind of things. If you're just someone who just feels a bit crap and just doesn't like exercising in the heat quite often. I was certainly one of those people who could have ticked every single one of those boxes that I just spoke
Mm.
through. And that's why a friend of mine, Dr. Jutley, was like, he said, I can sort of diagnose this without needing the test, but I'd like to do the test to validate that diagnosis. And he
Yeah.
was spot on. And we've even got, as you might have had a play with them, but we've got some online tools like an online sweat test and online fuel and
Hmm.
hydration planner that can help
Yeah,
people to self-diagnose, and get themselves in the right zone.
I'll definitely link to all of that. Um, awesome. Let's chat about preloading. What is it? When is it appropriate? And what would it look like?
Yeah, so preloading, we talked about this idea of like athletes over drinking water in the build up
Yeah.
to an event to prehydrate. And actually, preloading is pretty simple. It's that if you put up a very high concentration of electrolytes in a drink and have a small volume of it, the night before ideally, but more importantly, the morning of an event, an hour or so before the start, you can improve your blood volume a little bit without just rinsing fluid through your system, because you're not overloading the kidneys. And so we have a drink called pH 1500, which has 1500 milligrams of sodium in a liter, and we often recommend that as a preload because it has enough sodium to help pull fluid from the gut into the bloodstream and keep it there without kind of being upsetting to most people's stomachs. There are
Hmm.
some other companies out there that have even stronger preloading drinks, which certainly theoretically could be very effective, but quite often they come with the risk of GI distress, which is not something you want immediately before a race. So
Yeah.
we kind of recommend something around 1500. And if people are if anyone's interested in having a way deeper dive on that, we've got this blog on our website called How to Start Hydrated, and it literally every year it's one of the most read blogs on the website. So I'd certainly
Awesome.
recommend checking that out for a deep dive into
Awesome.
that.
Yeah, and it's funny because I mean, kind of going back to that whole like public messaging on sodium, I think a lot of people see 1,500 milligrams of sodium, they're like, "Wait, what? Oh my God, that's so much!"
Yeah,
And especially given the fact that the average, kind of like normally on the shelf type of drink, your Gatorades and whatever else has like such a lower amount of sodium in it. Again, we really need to kind of get over this messaging that we need to be afraid of sodium, and that you know even an amount of like 400 to 700 ish, which is where a lot of these drinks sit, is enough for everybody when it
yeah.
often isn't. So um, that's that's a good actually segue to my next question. I promise I'll wrap it up because I know I've kept you so long, but
You're
this
good.
is such a great conversation. I'm sorry. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, what's the best electrolyte drink or gel or whatever other product, right? What's the best? And
Yeah.
obviously the answer is like, there's no like best anything. It's really about what works for you, right? And there's a billion products on the market. You, by the way, you have a whole set of products, which I can't wait to try. I haven't tried it yet, but you guys sent me some, so I'm really excited to try those. But I think people just get really confused and they know they need to experiment, to figure out what works best for them, but
Yeah.
it can be hard to figure out where to start. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the different types of products that are available and how you suggest they are used, because you mentioned sports drinks. I know that some are, I read your blog post on like the hypotonic, isotonic,
Yeah.
hypertonic drinks. So they're varying levels of sodium essentially and other things in there. There's ones with carbs and without carbs, or lower carbs and high carbs, and there's low calorie salt tabs, there's salt pills. There're just so many things. So if you have this sodium goal, you have this fluid goal, that kind of, well, now what? How do I reach, if I have those numbers, as we talked about, the number of grams of carbs, the fluid amounts, and the sodium that we're trying to aim for each hour, it's the process of getting there can be so daunting for people. So I'm
Yeah.
curious if you have any thoughts on that. Again, I know it's a huge topic,
Yeah.
but if you just have thoughts.
Yeah. No, it is a good one because it can be confusing. I would say rewinding out of it, when you're exercising, what you are losing or using or losing is three things. You're burning carbohydrates predominantly, you are sweating fluid, and you're losing sodium in that sweat. And so a good sports nutrition product or combination of products replaces the right amount of carbs, the right amount of water, fluid, and the right amount of sodium for you as an individual. There
Yeah.
are products that have all three of those things in. So a typical isotonic sports drink like a Gatorade or a Lucozade or a Powerade, that is about 6%, 6 to 7% carbohydrate, which means it has sort of 60 to 70 grams of carbohydrate per liter. It has usually around about 400 or 500 milligrams of sodium, which is quite a light sodium load, and obviously it's predominantly water. And
Yeah.
that's like the jack of all trades traditional sports drink that that kind of does a decent job for people who are doing short, fast activities or shorter, faster activities in not too hot conditions, because you often haven't got time and don't need a vast amount of any one of those three things, but you need some. And
Yeah.
that's just the go-to. So if you're running a half marathon and you can grab some traditional isotonic sports drink and it's not too hot, then that's probably not a bad thing to have a few mouthfuls of to keep you going on the way around. But for most more sophisticated athletes who are doing longer stuff, it's a good idea to then look at separating out those different pieces and sort of getting them from different places. And if you want to use a drink for hydration purposes predominantly and not to replace energy, which is what we want in hot conditions, then a drink which is relatively high in sodium or has a sodium content which is congruent with what you're losing, and is either has no calories or very light amount of calories, so it's hypotonic rather than isotonic, so it's a lower concentration in your blood, you'll be able to tolerate and stomach a lot higher volume of that. It will move through the gut into the bloodstream faster and hydrate you a lot better. So a good sports drink in the heat has a lot less carbohydrate or no carbohydrate and a lot more sodium than one that you would use in colder conditions, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one way to look at it. And then there's also other factors which are more basic, but like, do you like the taste of a particular drink or not? Because it's no good if you feel like the drink that you might want to use comes in kind of watermelon flavor and you can just about tolerate it, but it's not your favorite. You get 40 miles into a 50-mile running race and are trying to choke down some of this horrid watermelon muck that you have to really like be on board with liking the taste of whatever you're having. And sometimes moving to like using electrolyte capsules with water is really good for people who experience a lot of taste fatigue with sports nutrition products, or people who just don't like the idea of it, or they don't like the taste of a flavored drink at all. They just want to drink water, but they want to replace some electrolytes as well. So you've got kind of the isotonic sports drinks. You've got for jack of all trades, you've got these hypotonic ones with high electrolytes, which are good for food replacement in the heat, or you've got a combination of water and electrolyte capsules or salt capsules if you want to predominantly drink the taste of plain water rather than taking something flavored. And I suppose it's good to think of those things like tools in a toolkit, that when you need to knock in a nail, you need to reach for a hammer. But if you need to put in a screw, you reach for a screwdriver. And it goes without saying that knocking in a nail with a screwdriver is not particularly effective, and neither is hammering in a screw with a hammer. So you have to look at what you're trying to do, and then you get the optimal product. We're actually developing a product at the moment which is in a sort of a late stage of testing, which has been requested by a lot of the marathon runners we work with, which is actually a virtually no electrolytes but very, very concentrated carbohydrate mix for running marathons in cool or cold conditions. Because you, as a runner, you're probably aware that the optimum temperature for running a marathon is really quite cold for most people. It's like in the single digit Celsius, because then you don't have to sweat too much, you don't have to manage body temperature, and as long as your muscles are up to temperature, you can run really fast. And so a lot of the world records are set in cool conditions. But what the challenge there is that if you are drinking your calories, as a lot of marathon runners do, you don't want to drink a high volume because you're not sweating a high volume. So you need a really concentrated sports drink. So we're working on one at the moment which has got 120 grams of carbohydrate per litre. And it's been really well received in testing in some races and some training with marathon runners, and also with some triathletes doing kind of Olympic distance races in cool conditions. Because then what you're doing, that drink is 12% carbohydrate. So by rights, you're not really using it predominantly to hydrate. You are using it as a fast delivery mechanism for lots of carbs. But if you tried to rely on that to hydrate you in the Western States when it's 110 Fahrenheit, you would become sick very, very quickly because it's just the wrong. So that's when that sort of hammer becomes a screwdriver, as it were. And you just you fit the right one for the job.
Yeah, and I think that's a point of confusion too. It's like if people are using both sports drink and water, it's like, well, how much of each and like where does the sodium come in? And oh, well, maybe I'm doing this product and adding salt pills on top to reach my goal. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of mixing and matching and what will be tolerated and so it can get highly confusing. Just to clarify one thing, the sodium amount, like you do the sweat test, you determine that your sodium loss. Are you aiming to replenish that 100% then? Is that what I heard you
Not
say, basically, or
not
no?
yeah, not necessarily replacing 100% of your total losses,
Okay.
but it's not
Yeah.
as a rule of thumb, it's not a bad idea to use a drink that's a similar-ish concentration to your sweat, because obviously then you're
Okay.
replacing kind of a like for like concentration. The
Yeah.
chances are, if you're doing it well, you'll replace slightly somewhat less total volume than you're sweating out. So your net
Uh-huh.
sodium replacement will still be lower than 100%.
Sure.
But
Okay.
as a starting point, yeah, I for instance, predominantly I'm losing 1800 milligrams per litre, and I predominantly use the product that we do, which has 1500 milligrams per litre in it.
Okay.
If we test you and we find out that you're losing 800 milligrams per litre, it's more likely we'd recommend you 1000 milligram per litre,
Got it.
and so on.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Two more questions and I'm letting you go, I promise.
You're all
Outside of
good.
exercise, how do we know how to stay adequately hydrated the rest of the time? Given that urine color and thirst are not always reliable indicators of hydration status, depending on who you are. Or maybe outside of exercise, they are a bit more reliable. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts of, kind of when we're talking about daily hydration needs,
Yeah.
including exercise, but outside of that environment.
I quite like sort of using regular body weight check-ins first thing in the morning
Mm,
is a good one, because I think if you're in heavy training, big fluctuations day to day in body weight can be can be attributed to either over or under hydration. So if I don't do it all the time, but if I am training hard, I'll have a set of scales in the bathroom and I'll jump on there. I'll get up in the morning, have a pee, jump on the scales, and then I sort of know what I was the day before. And if it's significantly down, then I might be more proactive with my hydration before I go out training that day, as an example. If it marries with other
mm,
things like, am I feeling a bit thirsty? Has my urine been a bit darker on occasion than others? Or vice versa? I might trim the fluid back if I'm peeing a lot and my body weight's normal or a bit above. So those kind of three metrics that, how thirsty are you? Generally, what color is your pee? Is it on the darker side? Is it like straw colored, or is it really clear? And then what are your day-to-day body weight fluctuations are a really good triple check. And when all three, like if your urine's really dark, if you feel quite thirsty and your body weight's really down, that is a slam dunk that you are probably dehydrated. And
mm.
and so you can use those kind of metrics to help dial it in. And I think if you then are over and above that, if you're getting that data feedback and then you're overlaying that by really like tuning into your body and thinking about how you feel, you can start to become good at predicting it. And that's when you know that you're getting good at just kind of reading the subtle signs that your body's telling you as to whether you're becoming dehydrated or not. Because we all know that the really good athletes are often extremely in tune with their own bodies, and you kind of get there with practice, and mindful practice is a good way to think about that.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. And lastly, what areas do you believe still need more research? And, what big questions about hydration or maybe about fueling generally do you still have? I'm curious, just as a sports scientist and given your business and everything, kind of what you're still curious about.
I think there's, well, as we've delved into, there's a lot of it depends answers out there still, and it
Yes.
is infuriating as someone who works to help other athletes when you can't sit down and give people definitive answers. I don't think we'll get there anytime soon where we can be categoric. But what I'm very excited about is the idea of wearable technology measuring sweat rate, sodium loss, and hydration levels coming to the market and starting to be tested. Because I think there could be huge value in overlaying some of that with some of the more subjective feedback that we get from athletes to start to look at trends in terms of hydration status and heart rate and power output and speed and all those kind of things, and maybe even getting some early warning signs that I'm not a big believer that we're ever, or not anytime soon, we can get there where we've got like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or a Garmin or something that
Sure.
can reliably tell you when and how much to drink. But they might be able to provide prompts to people to say, essentially to be monitoring, say, heart rate and pace and temperature and sweat rate, and then putting two and two together and seeing a trend or a movement in those numbers that indicates that you're becoming dehydrated, and therefore the watch might buzz and suggest that you think about having a drink or something. That kind of stuff, I'm hoping is, certainly not in the not too distant future, is going to start coming out. And we're working with a couple of companies that are working on various biosensors and trying to fill in that gap between what gets measured and then how you can manage that as an athlete. So I think I'm hopeful that that's kind of the next step for all of this, so we can get a little bit more objectivity and a bit more data around informing ourselves, when we need to eat and drink. Same with continuous glucose monitors for looking at energy replenishment, although they're certainly a long way from being everyday usable yet. We're seeing them crop up with more and more athletes, and that's a whole nother really interesting area where real-time feedback might actually be useful in telling you what to eat and drink when you're exercising.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Andy, so much. You've been so generous with your time. I'm almost double what I said I was going to do. But I was just having so much fun chatting with you, and you are so knowledgeable and really offered up some great advice for everyone. So thank you for spending time with me today. Where can everyone find you online? Company. Yeah.
Where
can everyone
find us at precisionfuelandhydration.com. Please email us at hello@precisionfuelandhydration.com if you've got any questions. We'd love to hear from you. We've got a great team of athlete support people and we love chatting with athletes about what they're doing. We're on all of the usual social media. It's at precisionfh. Come and interact with us. We've got free video calls. We've got lots of tools on the website, lots of blog articles and case studies. So come and find us online.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the rest of your time in Slovakia, and hope you get back home to your family soon.
Yeah, they're actually here with me, which is fantastic. So they've been in the water park all day. So I am going to put down the phone to you in a minute, and we're all going to go out and have some dinner. So excited for that.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll let you back to your family, and thanks again, Andy. Have a good one.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks. Bye-bye.
And that wraps up our show for today. Thank you again, Andy, for so generously spending your time with me. Guys, I hope you got some good takeaways from our chat. And if you're hungry for more on this topic, I strongly encourage you to check out Precision Fuel and Hydration's website. I'll link to a bunch of articles in the show notes, but their Knowledge Hub has some really fantastic blog posts on a wide variety of fueling and hydration topics, and the case studies are also fabulous. There are also tools on there that I think you'll find helpful, so check those out. I know I'm super excited to get my sweat tested, hopefully later this month, since they just happen to have a center in Santa Cruz, which is pretty fantastic. If you guys would like to try any of Precision Fuel and Hydration's products, they have provided me with the code EAT4ENDURANCE15 for listeners to get 15% off of their first order at precisionfuelandhydration.com. Again, that is EAT4ENDURANCE15. This is not an affiliate link. I get nothing from you using this code. They just provided it for your benefit if you feel like giving them a try. And lastly, as always, I love hearing from you guys, so please reach out with any feedback or questions, and please rate and review the show wherever you listen to help spread the word. Thank you all, and have a fantastic weekend.